from other side to wave this pilgrims to Kartarpur. And from Pakistani side, our Prime Minister, Pakistan should have a balanced policy. It should think for people of Kashmir in a similar way as they.
Very comprehensive output. I would like to welcome honorables which just Mr. Gilani has mentioned. Now I would like to this Article 370 and 35A 2 years back, and that was all over in the media. In August, we have witnessed that was a surprise news for the rest.
My deepest gratitude to PIX for inviting me to comprehensive overview of the constitutional mechanisms of the situation. Because I think the NDA government in their previous tenure was part of the election. The NDA government had 5 years and I'm sorry to say, and this is one aspect with the BJP or the NDA government or the Hindu faction, whether it was a soft pending watchfire outing in this in 1998 they talked about bilaterally, multilaterally, unilaterally, any of the decisions that have been signed on this occupied. We did the exercise February 26. There was not a single to freeze the problem, not to say anything that India had done wrong, right? So that we have this default mechanism on our side, that we always look for the good stuff. At least I don't think with Narendra Modi, Pakistan should have had any doubts. Don't consider it to be just election rhetoric or just sloganeering. Consider that they are going to end up what they had to do. There was severe human rights violation, occupation. What we see happening on Kashmir is, unless there is a full-fledged war, a reversal in the occupation of territory. The territory which has been occupied is going to be held. It can be holded and can be change the status. So there are a lot of risks to the question. It is going to give rise to a lot of issues, not only on the human rights front. You consider it on the international level. Right? There's so much of human rights violation. A stellar presentation at the UNSC. Excellent, wonderful. People were moved.
That I was seeing the questions about isolation and so forth, and why our narrative isn't selling. I beg to differ. I think for the first time, Pakistan has taken up the narrative of fascism, of the linkage between Modi's fascism, Hindutva creed, and Nazi Germany, and I think that narrative has taken off. We have had more focus on Kashmir's violations in occupied Kashmir by the international media. There has been talk that only 3 countries supported Pakistan. But look at the countries that have held hearings for the first time in their, whether it's Congress, whether it's the British Parliament, whether it's the EU, which organized a Kashmir week. And in January, they had, for the first time, a session where they discussed human rights violations in occupied Kashmir. So I think the narrative of the Pakistan government has taken off. I think that there is more that we should have done and we should do. But to simply say that nothing is working, I think is absolutely incorrect. And the one thing that has happened is, because of Modi's attempts to annex occupied Jammu and Kashmir, there is a greater reaction internationally to the occupation force of India than there ever was before. The Indian narrative of trying to pin everything that happens in occupied Kashmir as terrorism from Pakistan, for the first time does not wash with the international community. The world, for the first time, because of the siege that has gone on for over 100 days, recognizes that there is an occupation force, there is an occupation government, and it is violating all international rules, all international law relating to occupation. So my argument is that the narrative that we are now putting forward has worked and has taken off, and this is because we now have a cohesive narrative. If sadly, over the decades, previous Pakistani governments never really had a proper narrative on Kashmir. There was confusion. There was Musharraf, who suddenly devised 4 plans, and then after coming back from Agra, had a meeting and said, now tell me how I should rationalize these 4 points. This is the level of unthinking that went on in the corridors of the governments that were there previously. Nobody spoke about Kashmir. Only when there was a local intifadas that erupted, then suddenly, maybe a month or two later, the Pakistan government would wake up and start giving a statement on Kashmir. So sadly, previous Pakistani governments, military and political, themselves never really had a cohesive narrative on the issue of Kashmir. We do now, and the narrative is viable, and it is a narrative that we need to take forward. The other issue I want to talk about is that it's all very well to talk about human rights abuses in occupied Kashmir, but we need to have a better approach. We need to focus on international law and violations of international law, because then the violations are not restricted to human rights, they become war crimes. Our focus should be on war crimes. Sadly, our Foreign Office has not even one international law person right now in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which does not help the cause at all. But a lot of work has been done by organizations like RSIL and so on, and we need to adopt an international law legal perspective. We need to take up the issue that what the Modi government is doing in occupied Kashmir is nothing short of war crimes. We need to talk about the abuse and the violation of international laws, that, including laws of war, that the occupation forces and the occupation government is doing. And I totally agree that the language we should use is not security forces. We should always use Indian occupation forces, Indian occupation government. And frankly, in all the tweets I do, I always use that phrase, because it's an occupation force. Whatever Modi is doing is straight out of the Israeli playbook in Palestine. And by the way, I did remember George Habash, but when you said, can you remember any other name? Anyhow, the point is, what India is doing is committing war crimes. It's as simple as that, and that is the position that Pakistan should take, not simply say human rights are being violated. No, India is committing war crimes. And if you take anything, you take the ICJ judgment on the wall that Israel built, it said changing the demographics of an occupied territory can be considered a war crime. Look at Geneva Convention 4, again, war crimes if you change the demography in an occupied state. It is an occupied state by any definition, and UN Security Council resolutions are extremely critical. Anybody who says forget about UN Security Council resolutions should remember, one, that Pakistan's legitimacy as a party to the dispute rests in the UN Security Council resolutions, and two, if you read UN Security Council resolutions, I don't remember the numbers, but I remember the years, 1951 and 1957, they state categorically, you know, the Indian argument that they've had elections and therefore plebiscite is not needed. They state categorically that local elections are no substitute for conducting a plebiscite. So the position and the demands of a plebiscite under UN supervision are critical, and that is what these UN Security Council resolutions state. The problem is that we have forgotten UN Security Council resolutions, and we need to recall them, because that is the point that we need to stress over and over again. India can have 100 sham elections. in occupied Kashmir. They cannot replace, according to the UN Security Council resolutions, the need for a plebiscite to ascertain the views of the Kashmiri people. And this whole argument is irrelevant at this stage, whether Kashmiris want to join Pakistan, although let's not forget all martyrs are buried in Pakistani flags. Kashmiris, when they protest, carry Pakistani flags, but put that aside. The main issue is the Kashmiris have rejected Indian occupation, and they need to be given the right to decide their future. How they decide the future comes at a later stage. It is not an argument in which we should get involved right now, and we don't need to get involved in that argument at all. So that's the other point I want to make on it. Also, I think that my view is that you cannot, suddenly this issue has come up, and I really don't know where and why, about exile, governments in exile. The Azad Jammu and Kashmir government is the representative of the Kashmiris. They are the part that the Kashmiris freed from Indian occupation. So you cannot have another government in exile. If you read the Azad Jammu and Kashmir constitution, as far as I remember, the government represents all Kashmiris. That is what it says. That is what we subscribe to. And we cannot undermine the Azad Jammu and Kashmir government, which represents all Kashmiris and works in an area that was liberated from Indian occupation. So I think it does us no service to start raising issues of having an government in exile. It, in my view, is not a viable option. Yes, we need to legitimize and strengthen the AJK government. We need to give a voice to Kashmiris on both sides of the line of control. We need to have more representation of Kashmiris when the fight, or when we are propagating or supporting the cause in international forums. I think we can make our case much better if we don't send people from Islamabad and we send Kashmiris to the Human Rights Council. We have lost so much ground. I've seen videos and pictures of 10 people sitting only when our boys from Islamabad go and participate in the UN Human Rights Council. I think we have to change the way that we work there. Our voice is not carried. And we also, it's very unfortunate, all resistance movements develop a culture of resistance. We have not been able to evolve that culture of resistance in terms of music, poetry. It's there. We need to collate it and give it a central role. Resistance movements are carried forward. They appeal to people all over the world through a culture of resistance that comes up with the military aspects and the political aspects of a resistance movement. That has been missing, and I think that gap needs to be plugged very actively. Also, so far we deal with the Kashmir issue at the level of state-to-state relations. We need to move beyond. We have, for example, Amnesty has done reports on Kashmir even now. Human Rights Watch has done extensive coverage of the violations by the occupation forces and occupation government in Jammu and Kashmir. We need to have more interaction. We also need to focus on issues like abuse of women and children. For the last week, I have been tweeting that why is UNICEF talking about children in Cameroon being denied access to schools, but UNICEF is keeping silent, which is shameful, about the not only children being denied access to schools because of the siege in occupied Kashmir, but children living in fear. And we've had Muzammil talk about the fear and how the children and young children, not even adults, young boys are being tortured to send a message of fear. Why is UNICEF quiet about it, and why are we not doing anything? I wrote a letter to UN OCHA asking for a humanitarian corridor to be established, which has been done in all conflict zones, and occupied Kashmir is effectively a conflict zone. Sadly, I did ask our previous ambassador to the UN, perhaps you could follow this up, but it was not followed up, and I'm hoping that the present ambassador will, because demanding a humanitarian corridor and getting a positive response from the UN, whether the Indians allow it or not, it makes a difference. It adds to the case that you're building up. We should not be hesitant because we think India will not agree to it. Let India not agree to it. We should carry on as we are doing and to push forward this issue. I think also we could have tried to get a resolution in the Human Rights Council on the Kashmir report recommendations, which would have been much easier because we would not be asking the Council for something that Pakistan has done. We would be asking for the UN Human Rights Council to implement a section of the report which deals with the council, and that is setting up an independent investigation committee to investigate human rights abuses in Kashmir. So it is the UN Human Rights High Commissioner's Office is part of the UN. So it would have been difficult, I think, for the council to reject a report done by one of its own bodies. And that is the approach we should have taken. I'm not privy to why MOFA decided not to, but regardless of that, in the same way, I think we should have asked through the UN General Assembly, and all we needed was a majority vote. So even by one vote, we could have gotten it for an advisory opinion on the annexation. Because even though the ICJ is highly politicized, by the way, Gambia went on behalf of the OIC. And my hunch is that there is one of the judges in the ICJ is from Gambia. I think so. Anyhow, I could be wrong. But the ICJ is a highly political organization. Let's be very clear. We know the history of how the Indian judge unseated the British judge, had him thrown out and came in his place. Pakistan, of course, was merrily sleeping and not concerned as to what was happening, and we are suffering as a result. But while taking the case may be problematic, asking for an advisory opinion from the ICJ would be extremely effective, because the ICJ itself has set a precedence in its judgment on the wall, where it says any alteration of the status or the demography of an occupied territory is committing a war crime. So we should still do that, because it bolsters your case. And because the ICJ has a precedence, it would find it very difficult to have a different position on what the Indian forces are doing in occupied Kashmir. So on that issue. Then I think we are not focusing on the abuse of women. And I think here again, it becomes crimes against humanity. So instead of talking about human rights, what we should talk about is humanitarian laws and the violation of international humanitarian laws, because they have much more severe consequences and punitive actions than just talking about human rights. For example, in 31st October 2000, interestingly, look at the date, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which recognized the need to understand the consequences of armed conflict on women and children, so as to develop and strengthen institutional arrangements guaranteeing their safety as well as their participation in any peace process that happens. We have not used this UN Security Council resolution at all, because in all our policies so far on Kashmir, we don't touch on the abuse and rape of women. Officially, we talk occasionally, but we haven't focused, and we should focus on that. You had international criminal tribunals in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, and they highlighted the concept of rape as a weapon of war. And rape as a weapon has been used systematically and persistently by the occupation forces in Jammu and Kashmir. And it keeps recurring. For example, May 1990, a young woman, Mubina Ghani, was raped. Inquiry conducted, but the officer found guilty was never punished, of course. Then in July 1990, you had another case where a border security force official raped a 24-year-old, and the case was registered, and so on. And then, of course, you have the mass rape conducted in the villages of Pushpora and Konan, where actually the Indian occupation forces went in, separated the women from the men, and then en masse raped those women. Nothing has happened so far. These are not fictions that Pakistan is creating. These are documented in Indian court data. This is documented within the data and cases filed in Indian courts. So we need to take up these issues, which sadly we are not doing so. In fact, there was a rapporteur for a special rapporteur on violence against women, and she went to India and did a report where she was there in India from 22nd April to 1st May 2013, and she touched on this issue of how the Armed Forces Special Powers Acts and so on have been used. She emphasized how the Army Act in India, 1950 Army Act, limits the scope for civil courts to consider allegations of violence against women and so perpetrated by occupation officials and so on. This is a report that we haven't made use of also. So I think really we need to widen the scope of our Kashmir policy, look at the cause of women, and of course children's rights. Why are we not focusing on the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Why are we not looking at the UN Security Council resolutions, the second protocol attached to the Convention on the Rights of the Child? Children are being abused, they're being denied their human rights, and we are not doing anything about it. So there's a plethora of international laws that India is violating, and we need to take up the issues in all the forums, not just the UN or the Human Rights Council in Geneva. We need to, in other words, be far more active on these issues. And by the way, Kashmiri women, we salute them, because despite all the violence perpetrated against them, since 2014, 23rd February, they mark as Kashmiri Women's Resistance Day. And it's commemorated there, because this was the day on which the mass rape and torture took place in Pushpora and Konan. So we should also highlight this day when it comes, because we need to stand in solidarity with the abuse that occupation forces are doing to women. And finally, I also want to add that for Pakistan, it's not just about Kashmir. Yes, that is the main issue. It's about India's annexation policy, but that has to be linked with an overall agenda of ethnic cleansing that India is doing of Muslims, not just in occupied Kashmir, also in India itself, because that is part of the RSS policy of Lebensraum, living space, the Hindutva version of it. Nazis had that and nobody took notice. They appeased them at Munich, so Hitler marched into Sudetenland and said, need living space for the Germans, get the hell out, and broke up Czechoslovakia. The same thing is being done by India. We need to highlight. Our narrative is there. We need to connect the dots, because now annexation of Jammu and Kashmir has become part of the wider Indian policy of ethnic cleansing and genocide of Muslims. Let there be no doubt about that whatsoever. In fact, just in passing, let me mention, India is India is one of those countries that expanded its borders through the use of military force after it became an independent country, Goa being the first example, and before that, of course, sending its troops into occupied Kashmir on this so-called accession document, which nobody really has seen. But the Indians themselves talk about that it had a condition that the eventual fate would be decided through a plebiscite. I do disagree with Muzamil. I think it's very important for the younger generation to know history. If you do not know the history of Kashmir, you will not understand the problems that are being faced by the Kashmiris. You will not understand the position that the Pakistani state takes. Sadly, in Pakistan, the study of history generally is forgotten. But I think we need to know the history of how the Maharaja actually got Kashmir in the first place, and how then the so-called accession and whatever else. So I will not continue after this. I think I've said more than I should have. One other aspect which I will not touch on, but which is very important, is that just to remind people that in terms of, we keep saying that India could start a war and that could eventually unintentionally lead to a nuclear exchange. I would like to put it to you that India has already climbed the escalation ladder of conflict. First, there was the non-kinetic level where they have been trying to blacklist us in FATF so that our economy is destroyed, where they are trying to continue linking the word terrorism with Pakistan while conducting state terrorism in occupied Kashmir. And then at the kinetic level, what happened in Balakot was a surgical strike. It's another thing that it failed, but it was a surgical strike. The sending of cluster bombs across the LOC. This is against the 1983 Inhumane Weapons Convention, which Pakistan and India are parties to. So my question is that if India has already begun climbing the escalation ladder, the question the international community needs to ask is, which rung will it climb to next? And for Pakistan, if we are saying that war is inevitable or war may happen, then we also have to show some movement on the ground. If we are sitting pretty, and then nobody is going to believe you when you say India has started on the road to escalation of conflict and war. So we have to match our words with our deeds. I'm not saying start a war, but I am saying there has to be some messaging and signaling conveyed in real terms, in actions. So with that, I will end and hope, because the challenge is there, and the challenge has created massive opportunities for the first time in Pakistan. Thank you.
Abroad. I think as a military man, without talking of war, before called the fifth generation of fifth generation war, and I would like to draw the attention of which they already, I'm sure, but there is no harm in reiterating that as I said, that the Modi's cards are still not, complete. He is still playing his cards, and there is a great vulnerability in our Foreign Office and, of course, our Pakistani diaspora abroad. Give a message to the custodians of, and who talks of high moral grounds and high moral values. On honor, it is better to die with honor rather than being an economically aspirant country and compromising. We will be beside them. My message to the people of Kashmir, especially the occupied Kashmir, is that we were for the last 72 years, and one day you will see a dawn of, inshallah, freedom from.
Please clear the line of the cameraman.
Hello.
Dr. Salma, Sayyid Manzoor Gilani will actually present his books to the chief guest. Meanwhile, you can actually encourage the speakers by your clapping. Mazari,